Good morning, All Souls Community Church. It's Thursday, April 23rd, and I have had more trouble recording this one video than any video ever before, and it makes me wonder if God has something in store for us through this message. If God wants to reach maybe one or more of us in particular, and there's been some blockage here. And so I proceed with great caution, but also great hope that this message is particularly meant for one or more of you. If you see, all week we've been talking about lamenting, that lamenting is actually a gift, that as we enter into this mourning rhythm of railing against what's broken, but also releasing the pain and the suffering to the one who's got broad enough shoulders not only to carry our pain, but to carry us through our pain, our Jesus. That there we find this first step for understanding how to live through a world in crisis, a world that has broken, a world that doesn't function the way that it's supposed to, a world like the one that we currently live in with the coronavirus. And as we've learned the gift of mourning when it comes to the struggle of quarantine inside the house, when you've got family there and family relationships are broken down, and then also understood the gift of mourning when we recognize the struggle outside of our house. In other words, that we can't go outside of our house, that we're alone, that we're isolated, and we weren't supposed to be. That in both of those scenarios, God is meeting us. God is at work, bringing about redemption, bringing about wholeness, even in the midst of this mess. And this morning, I believe God wants us to talk about the book of Ruth. Because in the book of Ruth, we find something that I think many of us, all of us on some level, but many of us in particular are struggling with. And that's the loss of a dream. You see, the book of Ruth is all about this woman, Naomi, and her family that leave Israel and move to Moab for their dream life. They bring their two boys grow up, they take wives, they're expecting to have grandchildren and families, and then something like coronavirus comes to them. It was famine. Famine invades the land, and suddenly Naomi's husband and her two sons die. And what was this wonderful dream that they got to taste a little bit of becomes a nightmare that they want none of. And right away I think of those in our midst who obviously have lost loved ones. That's the first thing that this story makes me think of. And the railing of this injustice, death being a thief that has come to steal life where it has no business stealing life. But it also makes me think of those who are mourning the loss of maybe slightly lesser dreams. For those of us who are mourning the loss of a dream of retirement, right? You've watched your bank account basically die, your retirement fund go away. For those of us who are in our midst mourning things like graduation and prom, or a wedding, and all of the things leading up to that wedding. These moments in life that you've looked forward to celebrating and entering into, and they are life transitions that suddenly it seems like they've been robbed from you, and the life you were dreaming of has, on some level, turned into a nightmare. Am I talking to you this morning? Where are you on that spectrum? Because there are two things I believe God wants us to see in the book of Ruth. The first is, one of the things at play in their story was that Naomi and her husband brought their boys to a life without God. They intentionally left God behind. They left Israel and went to a foreign land. They did things that God said you weren't supposed to do. They weren't supposed to leave Israel. They weren't supposed to take foreign wives, not in some 21st century racist kind of way of understanding, but of God communicating through his relationship with his people that God wanted his people to be singularly focused in their hearts and minds, not being pulled astray after other false gods, but to be committed to him and him alone. Why? Because he alone is the God of life, which is why when they left him, what they found was the opposite of him. In other words, death. And I think there's an invitation in that one aspect, that first point this morning, for all of us to take stock in our lives and to ask this question: where have I been dreaming of a life that is without God? Where have I been planning for my future, for my hopes and dreams in a way that's been, quite honestly, all about me and hasn't really contained or entertained or invited God into the story? Where have I been dreaming dreams, in other words, that leave God behind? For Naomi and for her family, that resulted in the opposite of God. And I wonder where in our own lives there have been the fingerprints of that reality, and maybe more than that, the inbreaking of that reality. A life without God, a life without life. The second thing that I think God wants us to see is that even though that was the case, and even though there was a whole bunch of things worth mourning, that wasn't the end of their story. For you see, God brought them back to Israel. He used the famine to bring Naomi and her new daughter-in-law, Ruth, back to Israel. And in Israel, what they found was God was at work even through the famine, preparing a place for them, preparing a husband for Ruth, a grandson for Naomi, and the line, if you will, the family line of King David, and then later, generations later, another king named Jesus, the one who would come to redeem everything broken in this world. So to put it a different way, they dreamt a dream that didn't include God and was much smaller than the one that the God who loved them, even when they rejected him, the God who called them back to him, even when they didn't deserve it, that God dreamt a much bigger dream for them. And through that dream, he not only blessed Naomi and Ruth, but he blessed all of us, because through their line, Jesus came. And so what's the challenge for us today? The challenge for us, the invitation for us, is to take stock. Where have I been dreaming dreams that don't include God? Where have I been seeing the death of dreams, whether they include God or not, that he wants me to bring to him and to mourn and to begin to believe and trust that the same God who brought redemption to Naomi and to Ruth is the same God who's at work in my life today with the very same promise that he will indeed dream a bigger dream. He already has dreamt a bigger dream for every last one of us. And he invites us into that dream to begin dreaming with him. The death of a smaller dream, redeemed into the birth of a much bigger one. Perhaps God wants you to dream bigger today, even as you rail against the loss of your dream, for it's a real loss. Part of the releasing is learning to trust that he sees you, he knows you're hurt, and he's got a much bigger plan in place. Beloved, that is enough reason for us to walk through this Thursday encouraged. God be with you.